She's got no help from the system, very little support, but she's now a qualified counsellor, and she's now working with both people who have been through this themselves and also with children. And she wants to broaden her horizons further and go on and study more. And when you meet people like that, it makes you realise how inadequate you are. But I've had experiences at the other end of the spectrum as well. I have a daughter who's now 34 and who was born with Down syndrome. And from a very, very early age, needed help and support from the state system. And all that help and support had to be negotiated, advocated for, battled for, and so on. And it had to be battled for against a system whose first priority is to teach parents to be grateful. Always has been, always will be. I'll never forget an experience I had. In fact, it was during the time I worked for John Bruton's government, and we were very, very heavily involved at a delicate stage of Anglo-Irish negotiations. And I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to be a member of the Cabinet Subcommittee on Anglo-Irish relations. And I was learning all the time about the importance of language and about intricate negotiations and about how the wrong word can cost lives and so on. And I was called out from that Cabinet Subcommittee one day to a meeting with a psychologist and a social worker to discuss a stage of Mandy's development, a transitional stage of her development. And I went to the meeting, and halfway through the meeting I realised that these two professional people were talking to me quite slowly in words of one syllable. And it gradually began to dawn on me that there was something in their training that made them believe that if you have an intellectual disability, if your child has an intellectual disability, if you're the parent of a child with an intellectual disability, you're probably not very bright yourself. And certainly there are class biases in it and so on. Now, that wasn't just my experience. I shared that experience with a meeting of 200 people and asked them, 200 parents, and asked them, had any of them been condescended to and patronised in that way? And every single hand in the room went up. And that made me realise how inadequate some of those professional qualifications are, and how important it is that people learn not just from academic qualifications, but from real-life experience. Out of that experience, and others, came the idea that perhaps someday people with an intellectual disability could aspire themselves to third-level education. And out of that idea came a campaign which went on for 12 years, and which was laughed at and mocked by the powers that be, but which has now resulted in a third-level institute within Trinity College Dublin, which is rolling out education programs around the country for people with an intellectual disability. And if you've ever been to a graduation ceremony in Trinity College, they are the most solemn and po-faced occasions you'll ever go to, unless the graduates are people who hold a certificate in contemporary living from the National Institute of Intellectual Disability. It's the first time, I think, in the revered history of Trinity College that every graduate gave a clenched fist salute as they accepted their certificate. And all of that, and working in the system, working in a system where, we've all studied and we all know the connections. We all know the links between parental education and the development of a child. We all know the generational trap that a lack of education and a lack of educational access can cause. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is just one example of many that I could give you. We all know the link between education and mental health. We all know the role that education and its lack can play, for example, in the lives of mothers. And therefore, you come to see education not just as a tool, not just as something, because I was aware that this conference was in pursuit of in part a European agenda. I went to the Europa website when I was preparing for it, and I looked at the Europa website about lifelong learning. There's a special website about lifelong learning. And there's a little video, because we're not all very bright, there's a little video on the website that tells you about what lifelong learning is in this context. And it starts off by talking about globalization, technological development, the aging of populations, and the importance of lifelong learning in those contexts. And I don't deny that. I don't deny that at all. But the importance of lifelong learning in terms of personal development, in terms of self-esteem, in terms of mental health, in terms of the generational gift that you can give your children is far greater, far more important. And when I was listening to the discussion that you were having today, it occurred to me, because I wasn't sure what I was going to say until I listened to that discussion, it occurred to me to look at the mission statement of our Department of Education. And I looked it up. Thank God for Blackberries. The difficulty is reading it aloud because it's on a very, very small screen here. But it's not that easy to find, by the way. It's not on the front page of the website. It's in a letter from the Minister, a letter of welcome from the Minister. And it says, the mission of this department is to provide high-quality education. I want you to remember that word, provide, for a second, which will A, enable individuals to achieve their full potential and to participate fully as members of society, and B, contribute to Ireland's social, cultural and economic development. Chief among my department priorities, you'll be glad to hear, are the promotion of equity and inclusion. Interesting word, equity, isn't it? I know you debated earlier the difference between equity and equality. I've never been able to sort that out in my own head. But in the course of those same Anglo-Irish negotiations that I referred to earlier, one of the key phrases in the Downing Street Declaration and in the Good Friday Agreement and all of those is the phrase equality of treatment, parity of esteem and equality of treatment. We fought a battle with the British government over the difference between equity and equality for months and months and months before it was finally settled. And I never fully understood why we were fighting the battle, because I wasn't 100% sure of the difference between equity and equality. And I eventually summoned up my courage at a meeting. I mean, when you go to those meetings, you really do have to summon up your courage, because people quote Metternich and they quote Bismarck, and these are guys now who, you wouldn't want to be in the same room with some of the time. And I said, listen, I'm having difficulty understanding the difference between equity and equality. And a British civil servant, a very appropriately named British civil servant called Quentin Crisp, said, with equity, you get what you deserve. With equality, you get what you need. And the only effect that assertion had was to galvanise our efforts to secure the word equality, and we did eventually. It was a big negotiating mistake for us to tell him what it actually, for him to tell us what it actually means. Anyway, the word equity is the word that's used in the department's website. Oddly enough, and I've checked this out, the word equality does not appear in the mission statement of any Irish government website, of any Irish government department, including, oddly enough, the mission statement of the Department of Justice, Equality and Law Reform. Chief among my department's priorities are the promotion of equity and inclusion, quality outcomes and lifelong learning, planning for education that is relevant to personal, social, cultural and economic needs, and enhancement of the capacity of the department for service delivery, policy formulation, research and evaluation. Now, apart from any quibble I might have about words like equity, I don't think you can really disagree with a mission statement like that. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it, why free preschool education is being rolled out by a different department, by the Office of the Minister for Children. Why adult literacy is the responsibility of an agency which is sponsored by the department but not of it. Why adult education is very, very largely the work of the voluntary and community sector. And I think the reason for that is to be found in a mindset. And mindset is the word I haven't heard used today. And I think that mindset, in some ways, maybe